a venerable tradition in the early church of thinking about God as impassible, as immovable, meaning God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And what I think good catechesis does is help us to live as if that is true.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. A spiritual formation takes more than good intentions and clever sermon series. It takes time, it takes community, and it takes a vision of the Christian life that's thick enough to hold together belief, love, and practice. In this episode, I talk with Alex Fogleman about recovering the ancient and often misunderstood practice of catechesis, not as a relic or a rigid system, but as a lived relational process of becoming fully human in Christ. We explore what the early church got right about forming disciples, how modern approaches have drifted toward fragmentation, and what it means to cultivate a thick Christian culture in an age of distraction and rootlessness. Alex helps us see that catechesis isn't about information transfer, it's about shaping people who reflect the image of God in everyday life. So join us if you're longing for a deeper faith and ready to reimagine what discipleship in the local church could look like. Here is my conversation with Alex Fogleman. Alex, welcome to Shifting Culture. So excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
I'd love to know where your passion for catechesis comes from. Like, it seems to be something that you write extensively on. You've directed catechesis institutes. Like, this is something big for you. Like, where did it come from? Why is this a passion for you?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I'm one of those people that just like gets into one thing. I'm like, this is the thing. So dispositionally, I'm a little bit lean that way, I guess. But in this case, it was something I've always been involved in, sort of Christian education, adult ministry, church-based spiritual formation, those sorts of things. But it wasn't until I went to graduate school, I was at Regent College in Vancouver, and I heard the now late J.I. Packer talking about the renewal of catechesis in the church today and urgent need for that. That was not a light bulb moment. It was, I heard this sort of legendary theologian, statesman, elder churchman talking about this important thing. And I thought, well, it's probably important. I don't know what catechesis is. It was not part of my own tradition growing up. I was maybe vaguely familiar with the term catechism, but heard him talking about it, respected the man. It wasn't until moving to a different town. So after I was in Vancouver, I moved to Waco, Texas to start a doctoral program, started going to a church there, an Anglican parish there, for whom I saw the real power of catechesis take root in the local church. And so I saw what it could look like when a church really had robust, the way I define catechesis is not just sort of instruction, doctrinal instruction, but a robust sort of theological and spiritual moral formation alongside it. I saw what it could look like when that was sort of integral to the life of a local church. So not just, this is an optional sort of thing you can do if you're really into that kind of thing, but I saw the power of it for shaping the culture of a local church. There's larger effects for that at the broader church level. And then I was doing my doctoral research on, I ended up doing it on the history of the catechumenate, or in the early church. So 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, like that period, really the church's sort of formative life. And then I just saw it everywhere. That this was so important to the leading bishops of the day, the Augustines, the St. Ambroses, Gregory of Nyssa. I mean, all the people who we think of as major theologians, at heart, they were catechists. They were involved in the everyday instruction of believers as they were coming into the faith. So it was for me, it was a combination of lots of different things, but it was seeing it at the local church level, and then it was seeing it so integral to the history of Christianity that really sort of lit the spark.
Yeah, just like you, like growing up without the tradition of catechesis in your own tradition, I think there are a lot of listeners that really are like, "What in the world are you talking about? I've never really heard this word before." So, can you just briefly give us this definition, where it came from, and then what is it? Can you explain it in a way where maybe use some broader Christian terms where people are like, "Oh, okay, I know what that means."
Yes, absolutely. I am happy to keep leaning on strange Christian words. I I find the difference or the strangeness of the word to be helpful on occasion because it sort of doesn't allow people to put it into their, oh, well, that's basically just this. And then I say, it's not really that. So I've been more open in the past to using a range of words, and I'm really fine with whatever people want to do. But I do keep coming back to the word catechesis because it does name something specific in the Christian tradition while also being broad enough to encompass. It basically includes everybody. So I usually define catechesis as a basic but comprehensive instruction in what Christians believe, hope, and love. So basic meaning this isn't, higher level, advanced, master's, graduate level theology. This is at the basic level. It's at the level of foundations, but it's also comprehensive in that it's more than just, say, the presentation of the gospel, the kerygma, or the good news, proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. So it's beyond proclaiming the gospel, but it's not sort of advanced degree. So that's what I mean by basic but comprehensive. So foundation level, but you're hitting on the entire Christian life. I think that's one of the unique things about it that what catechesis is. And then the other sort of like faith, hope, and love, what Christians believe, hope, and love, that is in trying to expand on the comprehensive part of it. Meaning, again, it includes doctrine. It includes what Christians think, what it means to think as a Christian. But it also includes the spirituality, what it means to love, how it means to relate to God, and then love or ethics. How do we live? The moral life, the ethical life, whatever term you want to use to call that. So basic but comprehensive introduction into what Christians believe, hope, and love.
That's comprehensive, and that's helpful because I think a lot of people would think about maybe theological education or catechesis as like, hey, I'm just going to understand the doctrine and like then everything else will fall into place. You're actually moving things not just into the knowledge of what we believe, but then how do we live and what are our hope and how do we relate to God and what are those about? I think it's comprehensive, and I think that's really helpful because we see if we have a silo in one of those areas, things are not actually mature. People fall through the cracks. It's not a robust Christian life if you just focus on one of those things. As you were looking at the history, even through your doctoral thesis and, through this book, what did that look like of actually bringing that holistically together as the early church? What were they doing? What did it look like? What was the catechism or the catechesis of the moment then?
The main thing that one will notice about the early Christian process of catechesis is that it just takes a lot more time on the whole. Part of the reason for that is those relational dynamics of catechesis. So there's a sense of what it means to live as a Christian is something that is learned through living as a part of a community. We might now use the language of a community of practice, like a group of people that are not just sort of gathering because they like certain things, but they're gathering because they have a shared praxis or shared way of life. And so that process, they recognize that it just takes time to become a part of that community. So what the early church would do when someone wanted to become a Christian or just learn more about Christianity, to learn more about these people, typically it would happen through, there weren't Billy Graham revivals happening, in the second century. That was not on the scene. So a lot of sort of evangelism happened just through relationships, through community, through neighbors, or you would have people that were just like kind of what you might call a popular theologian nowadays, is somebody who would but this was happening all over the world. It wasn't just Christianity. It was all the ancient philosophers have their version of this. So you got Stoics and Cynics and Peripatetics and all these people. So you have people representing these different schools, and they're all interested in the good life. What does it mean to live well? What is true? And how do you live? And so Christianity sort of finds its way into this orbit, and it's doing some of the same things. So if somebody wants to come along and be a Christian, and they say, that's great. We're going to have you, what you would first do is become a catechumen. And that's really the where the language initially comes from. So a catechumen is just a title for somebody who is a hearer. They're or an auditor or a student, but they're not yet baptized. So it's this space where you're part of the group, like you're in, but you're not yet fully in. So it's a kind of in between space. And so that person, they come and they learn about the faith for a year, 2 years, some cases 3 years. They meet with other people that are also in that stage of being a catechumen. They're learning some things. They're learning scriptures. They are learning what we call the rule of faith now, but they're just learning the way of life. They're just learning what it means to live as a part of this kind of group. And then they're not told certain things. This is the other thing that's kind of strange about the early church, is that you're taught the sort of the rule of faith kind of things, like the basics of the faith, but they have what's called, they reserve certain kinds of teachings, like teachings, especially on the sacraments, or in Greek, the language. So sacrament is a Latin term, but the Greek term is basically our word mystery. So like in the ancient world, just mystery and sacramentum are kind of, they mean different things in their own different languages, but they kind of both are the languages used to talk about what we now just call the sacraments. So that kind of stuff says, well, you have to be, that's for the baptized alone. These are the sort of sacred mysteries, sacred rites. So it's a different kind of, and that's different kind of educational sort of culture. We want to now tell everybody everything all at once, and let you make your informed consumer decision about things. And they say there's a process to growing into life with God. And so their sort of pedagogy is premised on an understanding of who God is, what it means to be a human being, and how one comes into life with God. So part of my sort of fascination with this was the way in which early Christian pedagogy and learning was tied in directly to their understanding of theology and who God is, and what the church is, and all these sorts of things. So yeah, it's a really fascinating period. And again, a lot of this is being formed. It's kind of new, and yet you see a pretty thick culture of catechesis wherever you go in the Mediterranean world. So in Roman North Africa and in Gaul and in Cappadocia and Jerusalem, you start to see the same sorts of things, and some of it is kind of being regulated a little bit, like some of the early canons, in the Council of Nicaea. We know about the Nicene Creed, but one of the first canons in there is like, someone shouldn't become presbyter or priest like too quickly. They should go through a process of catechesis and then baptism. And that, there's this sort of understanding that these things just take time. And so a high sense of the value of growing into the Christian life, a sense of cultivating spiritual maturity, that sort of thing. So it's more of those things are kind of baked into the way that they think about catechesis and formation.
Let's go into the Reformation and then some post-Reformation periods. What was lost in catechesis? And then maybe what are some of the unintended consequences that have happened because of the loss of this robust introduction into the faith and laying foundations?
I think what you see, and I think for shorthand terms, and the specialists will get fussy about, Christendom language, and that's fine. They're welcome to be fussy. But I think what you see in a Reformation culture in kind of Western Europe in the 16th century is you have a lot of what was formerly being done through catechesis is now being done through culture. One of my favorite writers on catechesis is Gerald Sitzer. His book Resilient Faith, I think, is a fantastic book on understanding the ethos of early Christianity. But Jerry's talked about the way that in the early church he developed robust catechesis, and that is what led to the creation of a robust Christian culture. So I've heard him use the language of thick people, like forming thick people, and that forms a thick culture. But I think what you have at the Reformation period, you have the culture doing a lot of the work of catechesis. So the sacraments are the sort of shaping rhythms of the calendar. The church, not in a sort of, well, sometimes in a heavy-handed dictatorial way, but it's just the rhythm of the culture as like it all sort of stems from the Eucharist and back out into the culture and back to the church. So there's just a lot of that sense of who God is and what it means to live as a Christian is being done by a range of institutions, and not only the sort of, the local church kind of thing. But you still have the language of catechesis. And actually the reformers, the way that the reformers tell the story is that catechesis was lost in the dark ages of scholasticism. And that's not true, but that's the story that they told, is to say that catechesis was lost. Well, there were several generations of catechetical renewal, throughout the Middle Ages. Like there's periods of catechesis and renewal, instruction of new believers, instruction of priests and stuff. But the way the reformers tell this story is that the catechesis of lay Christians is being lost. And what we need to do is they use this genre of literature that had already been in use called a catechism. So they bring this literature and they simplify it. It had been, lots of different things would fall in the category of a catechism. But after the Reformation, it simplifies to the Creed, usually the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the Ten Commandments. And that becomes a sort of staple of the catechism. So now when you say catechism, most people will go to those three documents, usually something on the sacraments as well. But it tends to focus on that. But culture is still doing a lot of the catechetical work. Whether you're a Roman Catholic country or a Protestant country, culture is still doing a lot of work. But the term catechism itself is being reduced to usually the instruction of children, and depending on the church, something related to confirmation. The radical reformers are some of the first people to use this language of catechism. Luther's sort of most famously developed his small and larger catechism in 1529. But what happens after that is the relocation of catechism language into the space of children's education and children's instruction or confirmation. And that's been one of the, I think, the longer lasting legacies of catechism. So a lot of times when I say, catechesis things, people will say, we need more like instruction of children. So it's become sort of relocated to children's education, or a kind of like basic but not really comprehensive. So that's been one of the longest lasting legacies of that. An unintended consequence for sure, because if you go back and read Luther, he's very much interested in the formation of everybody, children as well as adults. And one of my favorite writers actually on catechesis is the Anglican priest poet George Herbert. He writes about catechesis, and he talks about he talks about how the different ages need catechesis, including the priest, including the person who's catechizing. Like it may be most of all beneficial for them to overcome pride in thinking that they don't. I've known this stuff for years. I don't need to go back and teach on the creed. Are you kidding me?
Why is Michael Jordan one of the best basketball players of all time? Is that he practiced the fundamentals of
That's
basketball all the time, and he was the best at the fundamentals. He was in the gym all the time. He was practicing the fundamentals. It's like, what do we do with the Christian faith? Are we practicing our fundamentals, and are we becoming more like Michael Jordan? He didn't say, "I'm done with that." He says,
Yes.
I need to continue to work at this over and over and over again so that he can become one of the best basketball players ever, or the best basketball player of all time. This is the fundamentals. So as you're looking at something today, if you're bringing it into the church, your book called Making Disciples, and so we talk about catechesis as making disciples. If we want to start to embody the ways of Jesus, to be more like him, be a disciple of Jesus as a community, what does that then start to look like within the local body, within the local community? What does catechesis look like? How do we become good disciples of Jesus? Love Shifting Culture? Well, subscribe today at shiftingculture.substack.com for early ad-free access to inspiring conversations with upcoming guests like Kurt Verbeek on radical justice, Tony Collier on embracing authenticity, and Liz Theoharis and Sharon Rebar on powerful faith-based advocacy. Don't miss these transformative discussions before anyone else can listen. Plus, your subscription supports the podcast directly. And remember, rating and reviewing Shifting Culture on your podcast app helps others discover these meaningful conversations. So visit shiftingculture.substack.com and subscribe now.
That's great. It really is, I think, a way, the language of making disciples and pairing that language of disciple making with the language of catechesis, I think is a helpful link for people to make. Discipleship is obviously a lifelong process and can encompass many things. To me, discipleship is a much broader umbrella. And catechesis is really about laying the foundations for lifelong discipleship. I mean, I think there's probably, you can think of other fields and other examples in which it's the case where if you start off on the wrong foot, it's harder to, your course just becomes different after that. What does it look like to get off on the right foot? And so I think what this can look like in the local church is this can be something that everybody in the church is a part of. I would love to see churches have an ongoing, a yearly, or 2-year, multiple year cycle where this is baked into the life of the church at worship, so that it's just as natural for someone to participate in the ongoing catechesis life of the church as it is going to worship. We kind of separate them out. This is worship, this is catechesis. But what I would love for that to see is more churches that have, link, because again, I think there's no escaping the sort of, it takes time to learn and to be formed. It doesn't take long to memorize, say, the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments. Like, no, my 8-year-old kid can do that, but that's like in the language of the classical education, people talk about, learning grammar and then logic and then rhetoric, the trivium. Grammar is the stage of just learning like language and memorizing things. But that's so that at the logic stage, you can then make connections, right? Then you can put things together and you see how, what I believe about God here in the third article of the Creed directly relates to the fourth petition and the third commandment, actually. You start to be able to make those connections between that. And what that does is help you as a Christian have a more comprehensive and coherent understanding and practice of what it means to be a Christian. So much of our knowledge, and I'm using knowledge in a bigger sense, is fragmented, and that's both education more generally and Christian education in particular. We're subject to a highly fragmented education system and a highly fragmented knowledge system more generally. So what this process of catechesis can do is help to rethread a unified and coherent vision of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a disciple of Jesus today. And so there's some direct effects of catechesis, which is like, people are more biblically literate, or they know what They know how to pray, and they know what it means to follow the commandments. Like there's sort of like more narrow goals, learning goals, you might say, of catechesis. But the bigger picture, what this is aiming towards, is cultivating a unified and coherent vision of the Christian faith. And so that's the sort of long-term, like where this is sort of heading. And that's where the sort of like, this is building foundations for mature Christian discipleship, I think really, really come into play.
If I'm thinking about education and educational theory, I'm also thinking about what does it look like to be a disciple. One of the things is practice and community. Like I'm actually doing the stuff. I'm not just learning about the stuff. And so how do you make that connection between the learning of the doctrine and then saying this is what the Christian life is, and then the practice of it in community so that we can actually experience it, maybe debrief it afterwards and saying, how to go. And then we continue to improve. We see this all the time with Jesus and his disciples he says, I'm going to send you out. Then he's going to debrief and, how to go and course correct, bring them back. These are the principles that we want. So how does that all work together so that we don't get trapped in, it's just about the knowledge bank?
Yeah. Yeah. I like to think of catechesis as kind of like this front porch between, the living room of worship and then out in the street in mission, or just the living of the Christian life. And so catechesis then becomes a space where you can talk about, reflect on, and understand what's happening in worship, but also what's happening in just the daily living of the Christian life. I mean, the Christian life is lived every day, and it's all of life is sort of falls into the category of what it means to be a disciple. But I find that without catechesis, like you don't have a dedicated space to reflect on what you're doing, either in worship or in mission. Sometimes small group ministry can kind of do this for people, I think. Sometimes that can work well. But what I've found is having that middle space of catechesis, what it happens is it allows people to really ask the questions that are troubling them, and they want to know that the things that they struggle with in prayer are the things that they struggle with in loving their neighbor, the things that they struggle with at work or at worship, like the things that they struggle with at church. There's not a space where you can, like, usually, at least not in the churches I've been, somebody just raises their hand in the middle of the sermon and said, but when I pray, I think of God this way, and this drives, this is terrible. Like you don't have space to sort of for people to bring their fears and worries and doubts and questions, just genuine questions. I mean, most of the people that show up in catechesis are just, I find there's a deep hunger to just learn, for one. I mean, we kind of underrate that. We just think, there's a deep hunger to learn, actually. And this is a place where you're trying to meeting the needs. You're trying to, like, people come with questions that they have, or I find a lot of people will come with kind of, I don't call them this, but surface level questions. I say, well, what does this church teach about the sacraments? Or what does this church teach about, pastoral leadership or something? These are things that I've heard that church people talk about, and I'm supposed to have an informed opinion about it. And, or they may come with sort of like live cultural questions, say about gender, sexuality, things like that. And I'll say, well, what does this church teach about this? And with I think it's extraordinarily fun, but what I've seen where kind of light bulbs come on, where kind of hearts and minds and souls come together, is in this fusion of, you come with your questions. It takes a little while for people to realize they can ask these questions. Some people have just been like, I'm not supposed to ask questions. I'm just supposed to go along with things. They realize this is a space where, like, everything is fair game. This actually isn't indoctrination, a class or something like that. This is like where I come with questions. And then what the catechist does, I've come to think of the catechist as like part instructor, but a better part spiritual director, meaning that there's somebody who can listen to the kinds of questions that people are asking, and they don't just sort of like regurgitate an answer that they've somehow memorized because they've memorized all the answers. But the catechist becomes somebody who walks alongside others in the discipleship process, and embodies and exemplifies a way of thinking and living as a Christian. So what becomes important is not just the answer that a catechist gives, it's how they live and how they think theologically. And all of that comes through. This is just one of the many reasons why like AI can't do your catechesis for you, because it's not the question and answer format that's common in a lot of catechisms is a literary genre that's trying to transcribe a personal relational dynamic. What catechesis where comes through, where it really ignites, is in the relational. This is the transmission of the faith. This is the handing on of the faith once delivered to all the saints. Like it happens primarily in the Eucharist and in worship, but this is an extension of that. This is an extension of the handing on of the faith, and its reception. Like, to be received, for the faith to be received, I think it needs to be engaged. It needs to be wrestled with. It needs to be asked about and searched out. People that talk about tradition as a transmission is a both handing on and a reception. We probably think more about I just want to make sure I tell you the right stuff, versus what I want to do is sort of think about how we're hearing, how we're listening, how we're questioning, how we're receiving, because both of those pieces are integral to catechesis.
When I'm thinking about, as you said, Stitzer talked about thick people create thick culture, and we have this thick Christian culture. You said after the Reformation, there's a lot of time the predominant culture around you is actually going to catechize you, and it's going to form you into whatever the culture is, more than the Christian culture that we're trying to help people live and embody. All of those things, it just reminds me again back to Ephesians 4, where it grows up into the head, which is Jesus, become mature, and that we actually don't get deceived by all the new teaching. When all of this stuff comes at us, we actually could stand firm. Like, there's a maturity. We know who we are. So then, as you're looking at tradition, and I think we've lost a lot of tradition, especially in the Western church, where I could see that we're being formed a lot by culture, more than anything else. How do we stay rooted in identity in Christ? So I want to know, what is a thick Christian culture? How do we produce that, help that, and not to be influenced by all the winds of new things? And even though some of these new things could be really good and it's great, but some of it could be destructive. So how do we do that? How do we root ourselves in this age of unrootedness?
That's the question. I love the way Alan Jacobs talks about this in his book, Breaking Bread with the Dead. It's a great title. But he talks about, and he uses this language of being tossed to and fro. And he's thinking about especially digital culture. But he develops this language of our temporal bandwidth. He's like, for us, our kind of temporal bandwidth, our understanding of time is very narrow. Like, our sense of now is 10 seconds long. We really can't think before or after the last social media post. Our temporal bandwidth is very narrow. But when we break bread with the dead, he says this is his case for him. It's just reading great literature, the old books. But what happens is we become people of a wider temporal bandwidth. Our now becomes a lot longer. And so that image has really stuck with me as a way of getting at what this challenge we face is in becoming people of a of a lengthier temporal bandwidth that aren't so easily swayed by the latest, opinions. And this is, I think this is exactly what catechesis does, because it doesn't just engage at the social media level. It meets people there, but it asks about what's happening below the surface. It asks about what's happening at the foundation. So instead of saying, well, what does this church teach about gender and sexuality? It asks, what does it mean to be a human being? What is a creature?
So what does it mean to be a human? Alex, what does it mean to be a human? It's the question of the age that we live in now.
The question of the age. I mean, fundamentally, it means something to be a creature, to belong to a creator. Our life is not our own, but it is given to us. So starting with something like even just a very basic definition of being a creature is someone to have been created. Our life isn't self-generated; it isn't our own. And then we say, well, who is the creator? We would say it is the triune God. We are creatures of the triune God, meaning we are made in the image of God, and then the perfect image is, of course, Jesus Christ. It is to be an image. One of my favorite theologians says it's to be an image of the image, to be made according to the image, and the true image being Jesus Christ. So we want to know what a human being is. We look to Jesus, and then we sort of draw from that again. So it's not a self-generated, it's not a sort of self-created kind of piece, but it is to belong to Christ. And so when you start there, then you're starting in a fundamentally different posture than saying, well, is it right for two people of the same sex to be married to each other? You're starting in a different posture. And what that does when you do that foundation level work, I think that is what creates the kind of temporal bandwidth. That is what allows you, when you can help people live in the foundational categories, when you help people create this sort of more unified, coherent vision of the Christian life, they become, it's harder to shake the foundations when you have foundations. So I think that's what it looks like to create that temporal bandwidth. You're creating a culture in which whatever people hear, whatever they're seeing, whatever they're hearing, they're not as easily moved by that. There's a venerable tradition in the early church of thinking about God as impassible, as immovable, meaning God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And what I think good catechesis does is help us to live as if that is true. And it helps us to live more like God. So it helps us to live more into the calling of the human creature to reflect the divine image. I see catechesis as helping us, particularly in the sort of unique charism of looking at foundations, and helping create those categories, the structure of the faith. So by doing that kind of work, which again takes a long time, that's the long-term payoff, is having a culture of people who are less easily swayed by the winds of time.
So if you talk to the readers of Making Disciples, this book, what do you hope that this book does? What do you hope that this book gives to the church?
I hope it's a word of encouragement and hope. I sometimes hear when I start babbling on catechesis, people would say, "Oh, that sounds like a lot of work. That sounds hard." Or if I compare the early church with a sort of 3-year catechumen or something like that, sometimes people say, "Oh, that sounds like a lot of." Sounds hard.
Well, you live in a culture in America like we do, when everything is instantaneous and you want things now. It's the microwavable culture. Like anything that takes time and effort is looked down upon. It is hard, right? It true. Is countercultural. So.
Yes. So in later revisions of the book, or in revising the book, I really did not want that to be the takeaway message. I really wanted it to inspire hope. So my hope is that people take up this book and that it inspires them to, again, I'm writing more for pastors and catechists and seminarians, that kind of crowd. So I'm writing for people that want them to take what they've learned in this book and then put it in practice in their local church. I'm not a super prescriptive kind of person. I try to give lots of examples and stories, both from church history and from the present. But I'm reluctant to sort of tell somebody without knowing them, this is what you ought to do. This is the curriculum. This is the books you ought to read, or something like that. I do a little bit of that, but I really want them to see the vision for what catechesis can do long-term for a parish, and then think about how that might shape the culture of their local church. So I see this work as sort of more at the inspiration and vision level that I hope people can be inspired to take what they've learned here, but then think about their own local context, and that's going to be different, for different churches. Like, they're going to be coming at it from different places. Some people may be like, we don't have anything like this, so it's just starting from scratch. For some churches, it's going to be, well, we've got like small groups that this could kind of. So for some people, it's like unfolding it into pre-existing programs, or we have a confirmation class that's like 3 weeks long, and we want to tell people like everything about being a Christian and what it means to be a member of this church and the history of the church and our denominational history, and we want to tell you all that. And 3 hours over 3 weeks and stuff like that. So what I try to do, a lot of the, like, why I do a lot of the history and theology of this is because I want people to have, I want catechists and pastors to have the deep foundations to know like what this is about and why you're doing this, and to see themselves as part of the church throughout the ages that has been heavily invested in this work. And so I want people to see themselves as a part of that tradition, and to be inspired to take what they've learned and to instantiate it in their local contexts.
Alex, if you could tell the body of Christ something right now, broadly, what would you want the body of Christ to take and know and do?
I would want to say to the body of Christ that there is a deep hunger for knowing the triune Lord. Like, there is a rich hunger. There's a deep desire to learn, to know, to be formed. I think we so often ask not too much, but too little. And that if we give people good food, they'll appreciate it and cherish it and want more of it. So I would just leave it at that word, that I think, as much as we, and I'm happy as anybody to lament the the tides of culture or whatever, but what I've seen year after year now is a little bit of exposure to the deep things of God. I've seen a rich hunger and response and an appetite. And all it is, it's not an appetite to learn more. It's an appetite to know God. Like, that is, again, if there's another sort of fundamental core to human anthropology, is that we were made to know God. It's part of our constitution as human creatures, is to know the Lord. And so catechesis, I think, is a way of serving people in that way.
Yeah, that's great. If you go back to your 21-year-old self, Alex, what advice would you give?
21-year-old Alex was, he was a funny guy. He needed a lot of advice. I would say something like, to be patient. The Lord is good. All things will be revealed in their due time. My younger college age was just like wandering around. It's so much sort of like, as many people that age are, but just that sense of like wanting to know the good, the true, and the beautiful, and like not having any like way to find them, not because people weren't trying, but because you just don't have ears to hear. But the Lord is good, and the Lord is patient and merciful.
Yes. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good. That's a good question. Yeah, what have I been reading lately? I have not had a lot of time for reading as I've just been moving. What I want to read and what my kids are reading and loving is the Wingfeather Saga
Yeah.
by Andrew Peterson, and 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 they're just loving it, and they're like, Dad, you gotta read this. So that's what's on my reading list, or that's like what I want to be reading. That I think I've gotten part of my doctoral training was being able to talk about books that I haven't read. And, so I can safely recommend this book that I haven't read.
Right. Yeah, at least your kids are recommending it. So
That's right.
that's good. That's
That's
great.
right. Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, how can people go out and get Making Disciples? Is there anywhere else you'd like to point people to?
Making Disciples is available. It's published by Eerdmans, and I'm sure so they've make the book pretty widely available. So wherever Christian books are sold, I doubt it's in any physical bookstores anywhere, but it would be awesome if there were some out there. That would give me great hope. So I've for a long time been developing a website called the Catechesis Institute. It's catechesisrenewal.com. And there I've tried to house a lot of sources that I've read over the years throughout the tradition, through modern day, different church traditions. So that's kind of a repository of kind of things that I've found helpful over the years that are related to catechesis. And then I just came on staff at Trinity Anglican Seminary, and one of my roles here is directing the Doctor of Ministry program, and also a program called the Robert Weber Center. And the Robert Weber Center is one of our main goals is to help renew catechesis in the church. So the seminary offers a certificate in catechesis, as well as in our doctoral programs, we'll be offering a concentration in catechesis and discipleship. So if folks would want to come learn and be trained to be formed as catechists, whether they're pastor or lay catechist, Trinity is a great place to do it.
Great.
Yes.
Alex, thank you for this conversation. Thanks for going deep into some of the history of catechesis, where we've gone off a little bit, and what it looks like today to bring it back so that we could actually form disciples and mature disciples that look like Jesus in community, in practice and knowledge, and some hope. And so that we could know God, we could know what it means to be human, and know what it means to live the Christian life in community together. So thank you. This was a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed having you on.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with you.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out. Share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.